Running never did much good. Hiding doesn't last forever. You can't run faster when it's you you're running from. So you throw your hands up like doves to the setting sun. Somewhere down the stars are falling like dews upon a thin black veil. You'll find the mysteries enthralling. 5 seconds seems like 5 billion years. 10,000 galaxies away, yet still so near.
Welcome to Karen Holton's podcast. Karen permanently lost 178 pounds and found happiness and success by following her own advice. She has now developed that advice into the quantum health transformation. Heal, evolve, and thrive. Karen's website offers a free webinar workshop series, and you'll also find tools, methods, and practices to assist you to become the change you want to see in the world. She believes that we are all connected. Heal the planet by healing yourself. Connect with Karen at her website, KarenHoltonHealthCoach.com, and through Facebook at Facebook.com/Quantum Health Transformation. Now for the podcast.
Today I want to talk a little bit about how we perceive the addict in our society. Generally, if we just say the word addict, we imagine some fiendish-looking person feverishly trying to plot ways to gain the resources in order to feed the habit. And except for the fiendish part, and except for the slant of judgment that we put on the addict, that's actually not too far from the truth. I want for a minute to just help you to understand more about what makes an addict. And if you're an addict yourself, as am I, whether you're in recovery or not, think about this, because the number one way to overcome addiction is through self-love, true self-love, not narcissistic self-love, but true self-love. And only in that way can the addict recover and find some balance in their life. But getting back to what makes the addict, just like nobody wakes up one morning and says, I want to be a prostitute when I grow up. Nobody wakes up in the morning and goes, I want to be an addict one day. I can't wait to become an addict. It's going to be great. Nobody does that, because to do that would be insanity. Instead, let's take a look at not judging the addict for a minute and looking at the larger context of what creates an addict. And I want to also be clear about my orientation on this matter. I'm looking at people as being a species from this planet, an animal species on this planet. Now, some people get really offended by that, but whatever. Take a look at it if you can for a moment. Use your imagination and imagine that we are another animal species on this planet. When we take a look at other animals, we clearly see how parenting affects the offspring. This isn't about beating up our parents. This is just about taking a look at the bigger picture. Okay, so there was tests that were done, I don't know, probably back in the 50s with monkeys, where they took monkeys away from their parents at birth and they put them in a cage and they gave them like a fake surrogate parent, which was basically like a towel wrapped around some wire cage material, and they could attach a bottle to it for food. So those monkeys went on to survive. However, in isolation from parents and other whole families, they developed to survive a certain way. Then later, when they themselves produced offspring, primarily the females we're talking about at this point, they had no idea how to parent. Absolutely no idea how to parent. And the offspring, again, not having the guidance and the assistance it needed, would then go on to reproduce, if it survives and if it can reproduce at all, more ineffective family members. And so this goes on and on and on. And a similar thing has happened to humanity. What would happen if in the bird world, also mammals like us, the parents pushed their offspring out of the nest too soon and said to them, "And don't you come back until you can fly back up here. This will make you strong. This is my gift to you." It would never happen, because the little bird would fall down to the ground if it survived the fall at all. And, please use this as a metaphor towards what we do with our offspring as humans. Okay, so the little bird wouldn't survive. It wouldn't be able to protect itself. Predators would sniff out that little baby bird, probably hardly got any feathers on it, or if it's got feathers on it, it can't fly yet. Because that's when birds leave the nest, is when they can fly, you see. And the same is true for us. And so when we think we're helping by pushing our children out of the nest before they can fly or before they can function, either because we didn't have the tools to teach them how to survive well and in a healthy fashion, or it was a belief system that said, get those kids out of the house or you're going to ruin them, basically. I know things are changing today, but I'm speaking from my own experience and in my own time. Okay. I saw a cartoon once that was quite funny, but not funny. And it had, imagine a tree in the forest. Well, actually not in the forest, probably in someone's yard, and there's grass around it. And below there's 2 eggs, uncooked eggs, on the grass. And if you look up, there's a really nice nest up there, and there's a mama bird and a papa bird. And the mama bird is saying to the papa bird, do you think we pushed them out a little bit too early? And yeah, haha, it's funny, but at the same time, think about it, and especially in the context of how addicts are created, okay? And you think about how a lot of young people, especially because the parents didn't have the tools to pass on, or were so preoccupied in a consumer and competitive society where popularity is more important than, I guess, coping with the social stigma of not being popular. But nonetheless, getting back to the subject, our young are not prepared when they go out into this world. And there are predators, even though a lot of people want to believe it's not true. There are predators out there, all kinds of predators. They're in all walks of life. There is no little category for predators, so you know what to watch for. And if these kids aren't prepared, they're hurt. They were hurt before they left home, and they're hurt even more in the outside world. I believe an imperfect family, assuming life and limb are not at stake here, is better than no family. And what's worse yet is some parents are so busy and caught up in their own lives, they don't even help with some kind of a bridging to help the young person. They just, out they go and they're on their own, and well, I did it when I was a kid and they can do it too. The world is not the way it used to be. And there are new dangers most parents aren't even aware of out there. One of them is the nature of addiction. Now most addicts are raised in families where at least one of the parents are an addict, because there's also some wiring that we acquire through our genetics that cause us to lean in that direction. And then you take all kinds of things that add extra stresses. And the more you add, the more straws you're adding to the camel's back, right? And the addiction is kind of the final straw. Well, addiction actually is more like just clearing some of the straw off, because That's what you have to do to make room for the addiction. And the addiction, of course, generally is pleasure-based. It is in the beginning until the brain gets used to it. I would say except for the only exception to that that I know of is cannabis, which I don't think is actually an authentic addiction. It's got its own mechanisms in place that kind of prevent you from going there. And that can look like anything from a bad experience to a sore throat, right? So more on that another time. So think about what makes the addict, and then ask yourself, being in a society which punishes addicts, or at very least requires them to be on pharmaceutical medication that affects their brains or their way of perceiving and being in this world. And because of the way our society is structured, everything is just set up that we need to all be producing and making money for somebody. But that doesn't work when you don't have the tools passed on by your parents. And so I think most people have done a pretty good job of trying to learn all they can to be better parents than their parents. And in some ways, breastfeeding came back, and there are lots of things that people are more aware of that are helping. But there's so much misinformation out there. And because they haven't found their own sense of self-love, they're not able to pass that on. And so I think the addictions is becoming a bigger problem, and it's becoming more concentrated. But fortunately, there is ways of changing your DNA and changing your health so that your own body and your soul can actually bypass the insanity of the mind and create lasting change. And that's another topic, because I don't want to make these too long. But in the meantime, what I want you to really think about, is what makes an addict. And then ask yourself, do you know anyone who's not addicted to something? And you need to include refined foods in there, especially the sweeteners and the refined starches, because they're all the same thing. And the weird stuff like the high fructose glucose corn syrup and that kind of designer sweeteners. And also all the artificial sweeteners and the ones that aren't considered artificial, but when you find out how they're made, they're toxified, or they're a high potential for a toxic infusion there due to heavy metals and things like that. So take a look at the whole spectrum. So food has to be included in there. And behaviors have to be included in there. The same thing goes with the abusive relationships. That's an addiction. And that's a very interesting relationship there, because what happens is, and I'm speaking from what is commonly the woman's perspective, but nowadays could often be the man's perspective, and that is of the one who is receiving the abuse. Because what happens is, it's similar to a bipolar kind of fluctuation in energy. What happens is the person is used to a certain amount of tension in their lives. And so they will participate in a ritual that brings that kind of tension into their lives, because they don't know how to be or feel any other way, and no one's ever told them. And so what happens is this tension builds and builds and builds, and at one point, one person becomes abusive to the other person. And because they both participate, they both have tremendous amounts of guilt, and that sort of fuels the whole thing to keep going. And then when one person abuses, for lack of a better term, the other person, there's always a reward to the person who got hurt. So the reward is immediate from the person who does the abusing, because there's a release of an intense amount of pressure that allows that person to survive. And this is because they haven't found another way. A lot of people escape that by going to addictions, which is also not a good way to do it. But if you can see this happening, so what, in your mind's eye. So then what happens is the person who is abused in our society goes into what we call the victim role. And the abuser becomes the abuser or the victimizer role, okay? And then often there's a rescuer in there, and everybody trades places, and this is the dance we all do. Society on every level set up like that, and all the nonprofits that are supposed to be helping are set up. It's just, we're steeped in it until we choose to look for other ways of doing things. But that, again, is another topic. But I also want to say, before I finish here, that afterwards there's a huge reward for the victim. And often the victimizer will then do extra things to try to make up for, which really benefit the victim. And all of this is very pleasing and satisfying to the rescuers. But it only lasts for so long, just like, putting a needle in your arm or taking a drink from the bottle. And then you're faced with kind of worse stuff that comes out of it. And if there isn't a shift, then the tension will build again, and on it goes. And the same thing is true for everything. There's actually very few patterns on how everything works. It's so simple, but the same pattern is used as a template then for everything else. So when we're thinking about the addict, and when we're thinking about ourselves, love the person inside. Love that person inside. Love that energetic being that is being transported by a body and has an irrational mind, like we all do. All of us have irrational minds because we've fallen so far in the imperfections in the template. It's like if you had a loaf of bread and you made beautiful bread and someone came along and used it inappropriately and it got a dent in it, it would then make bread with that dent in it. Even if you push the dent out, there's still going to be a crinkle. Okay, so our bread pans, metaphors for our DNA, have been really messed up, but we can get it back. So start by loving yourself, start by loving the person within, or the energy within the addict, and start working on mercy, forgiveness, patience, goodness, all the wonderful things that can actually change us and change the world we live in.
Lion only makes you hurt. Denying only makes it worse. Love and surrender seem the fastest way to bring an end to bitter, painful days. Somewhere down the stars are falling like jewels upon a thin black veil, and you will thrill to hear your calling. 5 seconds seems like 5 billion years, 10,000 galaxies away, yet still so near.